Greetings and salutations, friends, and welcome back to more Whatever 40k lore, where today we are going to be talking about Ork Psychers. But before we get into that, a quick public service announcement. I'm going to be rather busy the next 2 weeks, so I'll be giving you Horus Heresy on the 2 next Fridays, and then we'll be resuming a regular scheduling after that. Luckily for me, I've built up a fair bit of a backlog of Horus Heresy at this point, so I can actually put up lore videos even when I have to actually do shit in real life, so... benefit? Yes, yes? Anyways, Ork Psychers. Well, I actually don't think Psyker is entirely the correct term. A Psyker is somebody that takes energy from the warp and utilizes it to do various funny things, like make things go boom, or navigating starships through the warp. That isn't quite technically how Ork, quote-unquote, Psychers work. Instead, they draw the energies created by other orcs around them and harness that in a way that is similar to psychic powers, but not quite really psychic powers. So there is definitely a distinction to be made between the two, but in the name of simplicity, we're going to refer to them as Ork Psychers, or WEIRDBOYZ. Oh, by the way, a good notice, if it is a civilized orc, they're called WEIRDBOYZ. If it is a savage orc, they're WEIRDBOYZ. Important distinction. Now, let's dive a little bit deeper into that whole psychic energy thing. So, every single orc generates warp energy continuously throughout his entire life. In fact, every single greenskin does this. Even goblins and snotlegs, although they generate far less. Normally, this warp energy is at a low hum, a constant background noise, to put it like that, whilst in battle, every orc will generate exponentially more warp energy. This, of course, means that for an Ork Psyker who harnesses said energy, he is constantly being bombarded by the energies created by his fellow orcs. Additionally, the weird boy cannot simply just turn it off. He can't go, okay, I am not going to channel the screaming minds of my brethren for 5 minutes. He has to do it all the goddamn time. Seems like a bit of a design flaw on behalf of the old ones there, but interestingly enough, it's not entirely clear whether the Ork Psychers were designed as a weapon against the Necrons, which would make a lot of sense because the Necrons are not fond of psychic powers, and at the same time, the older ones also were not fond of psychic powers directly, but utilizing the Orcs to essentially harness warp energy and then feed it into the Psyker, well, that is a potential workaround. But there are also suggestions that these Psychers were a later mutation, so make of that what you will. Personally, I kind of like the idea that the old ones specifically designed these in this way, because again, they don't use their powers directly from the warp. They're not in contact with the warp itself. Ergo, theoretically speaking, they should be shielded from the corrupting influence of the warp. Makes sense in a twisted, roundabout kind of way. But on the other hand, well, here's the thing. Like I mentioned, they can't turn off them receiving psychic energy from other orcs. And in this case, the psychic energy essentially functions like, let's use a metaphor. Let's say that you have a bottle, and then you start pouring water into the bottle, until eventually there's no more room in the bottle. The water is then going to overflow. Natürlich, correct? However, what if we started teleporting water into the bottle, and there was no way for the water to overflow? Well, what would eventually happen is that there will be so much water inside of the bottle that the bottle will go poof. And that is precisely how an Ork Psyker functions. If he cannot dissipate all of the energies being constantly poured into him, he is also going to go boof. Or to be more precise, it's more like a loud banging sound, as if you popped a massive balloon filled with orcish gore and brain matter. This charming orcish social phenomenon is known as Edbang. And as with most things within orcish society, it does not conform to any kind of standard classification or even a vague simulacrum of such. An Ed-bang can do anything from simply being a loud popping sound that both the Ork Psyche and everybody nearby survives, to being an explosion large enough to cripple spaceships, and still somehow letting the Ork Psyche survive. Alternatively, the Ork Psyche could be the only casualty, with his head bursting like a ripe fruit. To put it like this, the range of damage that is inflicted by an Ed-bang could be anywhere from 0 to 1 casualty to everything within 100 miles radius. Some Ork smart boys speculate that the range of damage might in some way be affected by the number and excitedness level of nearby Orks. This at very least makes theoretical sense, but on other occasions single Orks have blown up entire starships whilst being isolated in their very special rooms. You know how Imperial astropaths have their own little bubbles that is shielded of psychic noise? A little sanctuary in which the Psyche can rest between warp jumps and stuff like that. It's kind of the same for the Ork Psyches. Kinda. Except instead of being a sanctuary for the Psyche, it is essentially a blast-proof room lined with lead. Oh, and don't get me wrong, it is partially, and possibly coincidentally, for the protection of the Psyche, but it is mostly to contain the blast. And speaking of Ork Psyche containment/warning systems, this is something I really miss from the older artwork, where you would always see the Ork Psyche wearing some kind of silly hat, for example, with bells on it, or a skirt entirely made out of bells. I loved this because it was essentially just implied that the Ork Psyche constantly made a jingly jangly clinky clanky noise, presumably to warn other Orks that there's a Psyche nearby. I both find this solution extremely practical and supremely orky, not least due to the fact that it might not provide any benefits whatsoever. An Ork might hear a jingling noise and think to himself, Ork Psyche nearby, probably is best if I step out of the area, or he might think, jingly noise. That must be somebody's favourite pet goblin. I'm going to go and eat it, for no other reason than to be a massive douchebag. And of course, the excitedness generated by the Ork's malicious intent, well, it might just be enough to make the Psyche go boof. But it is relatively unlikely. They're not that unstable. Oh, they're pretty goddamn close, but they have developed one safety measure that does actually seem to work, oddly enough. At some point during Orkish history, some exceedingly smarty-pants Ork realized that if you hand the Ork Psyche a stick wrapped up in copper wiring, then the copper wiring will essentially act like a lightning rod, and help prevent many of the more unhealthy side effects of Ork Psyches. And of course, as with most things Orkish, some smarter Ork quickly realized that this newfound safety measure could be weaponized. Firstly, a suitably unstable specimen needs to be found. Then, aforementioned Ork will have to have his legs bound up so as to make sure he will not be tempted to desert in some foolish attempt to save his own life. He will then be handed a copper wire-bound stick and brought to a suitably large group of exceedingly excited Orks somewhere near the front lines and placed smack dab in the center of the mob. And now begins the most delicate part of this operation. His handlers will carefully monitor the Psyche's behavior. Every small twitch, an errant burst of greenish lightning could be used to judge when it is best to deploy the unwilling weapon system. It is a difficult and highly technical job that requires a great deal of experience, subtle judgment, and attention to detail. And so it should come as absolutely no surprise to anybody that the vast majority of handlers cannot be asked to do any of that shit, and simply keep an eye on the increasing rapidity of the Psyche's vibrations. Once the shaking has grown to a suitably concerning level, the handlers point the Psyche in the rough direction of the enemy and take his stick away. And then they run, if they know what's good for them. Properly deployed, the ensuing deluge of psychic energy is enough to dig a literal trench in the terrain, and certainly more than destructive enough to remove any problematic enemy positions that might at some point have been in front of the Psyche. Alternatively, the WEIRDBOY will simply just explode, taking any nearby orcs with him. Because, as the more observant amongst you might have spotted, there are a few niggling issues with this particular weapon system. Firstly, the weapon itself is remarkably unstable. No, let me rephrase that. The weapon's instability is enough to give nitroglycerin penis envy. And then there's the handlers. Trusting orcs to correctly judge the moment when to unleash a psyche's powers is like entrusting a Ming Dynasty vase to a spastic with a deep-seated hatred for anything and everything Chinese. Granted, the relative volatile nature isn't particularly different from the vast quantities of other weapons in the orc arsenal, but, well, actually, yeah, now that I come to think of it, this isn't much different than the vast majority of weapons in the orc arsenal, so go ahead, I suppose. But, Arch, I hear you yelp. They're orcs, right? Why would you even need to encourage an orc to get into the battle, huh? They all love the battlefield. Why wouldn't the WEIRDBOY simply be running towards the enemy while screaming at the top of his lung along with everybody else? Ah, that is because they're not very fond of using their psychic powers. For an orc, being surrounded by his friends gives him a sense of immortality. It empowers him, makes him feel invincible in the most literal sense possible. For a WEIRDBOY, however, it is the exact opposite. Being nearby large quantities of his fellow greenskins will cause him nothing but pain and suffering, and as most living organisms are not particularly fond of pain or suffering, they will generally speaking seek to avoid it. And in a battle, well, all of those emotions are even more heightened and extreme, which means, of course, even more chaotic energies for the poor little greenskin psyche to deal with. Basically, when surrounded by their buddies, they feel like their minds are being torn apart every single second in the most horrifyingly excruciating manner possible, and if they don't let loose their built-up powers, they will eventually go boom. The problem with letting loose their psychic powers is, of course, that they are not always the biggest orc in the room. And if by some accident they were to fry an orc that was too big to die from being fried, well, that's going to lead to complications. Or maybe the psyche will fry somebody's pet goblin, which will also lead to very, very severe complications. The life of an orc WEIRDBOY is likely to be short, but at the very least it's also likely to be rather dramatic. The WEIRDBOY, on the other hand, would like it to be, well, not that. He'd quite prefer it if it wasn't that dramatic, and he would really prefer it if it wasn't that short. And as such, he is going to try and elongate it in whatever ways he can. Staying out of trouble would be one of them, and considering the only way of staying out of trouble for an orc WEIRDBOY is to keep as far away from other orcs as humanly possible, or orcishly possible, yeah, they're not particularly fond of battles, since those tend to attract large numbers of orcs. The fact that their head explodiness risk also rises rather dramatically is another pretty good reason for them to keep the fuck away from large-scale violence. And it is also very important to note that, unlike most psychers, WEIRDBOYs have practically no control whatsoever over their powers. It is entirely possible that a WEIRDBOY might try to explode the head of an enemy guardsman, and instead succeeding in turning a nearby orc inside out, and still keeping him alive somehow so that he can suffer a truly excruciating existence for the last few minutes until he finds something willing to kill him. In fact, it is considered a grand achievement amongst orc psychers to actually be able to make your psychic powers do what you ask them to do 1 out of 10 times. But, mind you, hashtag not all. Not all orc psychers will decide that their powers are something that they need to control or avoid using for fear of going bang. There are a few orcs that decide, well, I've been given these powers, it surely must be a reason behind it, so might as well just embrace it fully. These orc psyches are not known as WEIRDBOYs, but rather as warpheads. They have essentially decided that since they can't get rid of their psychic baggage, they might as well share it with everyone else. On the one hand, any aspiring war boss will be happy to have a warp head or two around, simply due to the sheer amount of destruction they're capable of unleashing. On the other hand, any aspiring war boss will also not be very happy to have one or two warp heads around, just simply due to the sheer amount of destruction they are capable of unleashing. With the important difference being whether or not they are unleashing said destructive powers upon the enemy or upon the orcs. And now that I come to think of it, there is actually one major difference between the erratic nature of an orc psyker and the erratic nature of all orc weaponry. The vast majority of orc weaponry will stay relatively quiet when they're not being used in battle. There's of course the exception when one orc decides that another orc is being a bit too sassy towards him, but generally speaking, weapons don't kill other orcs just by themselves. A warp head, on the other hand, well, that is a weapon that is far more susceptible to a little bit of friendly lightning, yes? And so, generally speaking, most orc warlords will try to root out these energetic individuals until they've assembled a horde large enough to, sustain the accidental deaths? Yeah, that's a pretty good way of describing it. An alternative approach, if enough Ork WEIRDBOYZ can be gathered together, is to organize all of them in a special area of the encampment, where they can be surrounded by copper wiring at all times, and of course having their trusty sticks near at hand. This will... how do I put it? It's going to make life very, very, very interesting in that part of the camp, as random psychic discharges are essentially going to be a day-to-day activity. Lightning flaring back and forth, items flying through the airs, orcs randomly exploding, shit like that. But, due to the psychic nature of all of the inhabitants, they themselves will most likely be able to protect themselves, relatively speaking, against the outbursts of their friends. And the rest of the orc camp will be able to stay at a relatively safe distance. Now again, relatively safe distance is, well, it's a complicated word, isn't it? On one hand, the copper wiring and the various barricades erected around the psychic camp is likely to stop most wayward bolts of green lightning. But if all of the psychers should have an episode at roughly the same time, well, it'd be more or less like having a hydrogen bomb in the middle of the orc camp. Orc numbers are sure to dwindle rather drastically afterwards, but it is fairly unlikely that all of the psychers are going to have an episode at the exact same moment, and yeah, that's the risk you take, isn't it? After all, they are very effective on the battlefield, and in many cases, certain Ork WEIRDBOYZ have also managed to position themselves in a slightly more esoterical sense. Instead of simply just being known as crazy people, some of them have decided to give themselves a little bit of branding, to make their presence a little bit more palatable to the poor orcs that are going to eat the random lightning bolt. Some, for example, will claim that they are prophets of Gork and Mork. Others will claim that they have a great destiny, that the various powers in the warp whisper to them. There is one orc, for example, that is utterly convinced that various gods are speaking to him at every single moment of every single hour of every single minute of every single waking day. He can't figure out what they're saying most of the time, but he's damn sure that they are talking to him. Whether or not said deities are even real, or if they have the best interest of the orcs in mind, well, these are secondary concerns, to be dealt with at a later date. Some of the more eccentric WEIRDBOYZ have even grown so much in fame and power that they've garnered themselves their very own little warbands, as is the case, for example, of the rather infamous Old Zogwart, an orc psyker that is constantly off his rocker on snake venom, of all things. He was literally born in a pit filled with vipers that bit him many times and injected him with literal liters of venom. Instead of simply dying, Zogwart decided to bite back. Natürlichen. Of course. What else was he supposed to do? And unsurprisingly, this act of defiance? Madness? Either one will work here, I think. brought him a great deal of fame, and when further bolstered by a rather ridiculous amount of psychic powers, an ability to handle psychic powers much better than even the most ardent warphead before him, to the point where he could literally dance through the middle of a battlefield, soaking up all of the warp energies and still not going bang. That made him rather famous rather quickly, to the point where he utterly eclipsed his old war boss and decided that he no longer had any business staying on one world, on his home planet of, Catachan. There is literally nothing on that planet that isn't literally certifiably insane, is there? I'm gonna have to do a lore video on Catachan and the Catachan Imperial Guard Regiment at some point, just to highlight the true idiocy of that planet. Horrible place. Anyways, these great leaders of Ork psychic kind are relatively rare because, well, they are somewhat unstable. The last thing you want when you're having a good old proper WAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAA rather detrimental to the war effort. And so only the most stable, quote-unquote, of orc psyches ever really garner much of a following, or, alternatively, the most crazy ones. That is, for example, one that is utterly convinced that by shouting at the sky, Gork and Mork will respond and tell him where to go next to find a nice big fight. Now, most orcs view this with a certain level of skepticism, but others figure, well, you know, there might be something to it, and if there is something to it, that means that we will, by proximity, be blessed by Gork and Mork. And so they reason that, at very least, it's worth a try? Not sure I agree with the reasoning, but hey, why not? Most orc psychics, however, that attain leadership positions will do so within an established clan and under the command of a war boss. Again, they're not always just used as a highly expendable weapons. Occasionally, they will have command of their brethren or even other orcs. This usually happens when an orc warboss has taken a particular liking to a particular psyker, and decides to give him a little warband of his very own, partially to keep him safe, and partially to give him something to hone his skills on. After all, if he isn't constantly exposed to the pain of being surrounded by his fellow orcs, how will he ever learn? And that really is the problem, isn't it? The weird boy has just as large a chance of frying his allies as he does the enemy, but they're always fun to keep around, if nothing else for the variety and entertainment they bring to any aspiring orc warband. I mean, what normal-minded orc doesn't enjoy watching one of his fellow orcs get turned into a mewling squig, or set afire by green ethereal flames? After all, they dance so prettily in the fire. Or simply watch a fellow orc be turned into a living lightning rod for a few seconds as his body spasms most amusingly. So whilst their abilities on the battlefield might indeed be questioned by the more pedantic of orc kind, nobody could ever question their ability to bring a smile to the face of their fellow greenskins. And with that, that has been my video on Ork WEIRDBOYZ. Until next time, I have been Arch, thank you very much for listening, and I hope to see you all again soon. Have a good day.